Well, thank you everybody for being here. My name is Rachel Stevens and I serve on the executive committee for the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. And thanks so much for coming. If this is your first community conversation, this is a series that we started when the pandemic happened, and we've been doing these conversations every Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock. Thanks to the good work of Steve Crowley, who's our fellow executive committee member and an energy chair. Steve, if you want to say or wave. And also Jack Cushman, who is the co-chair for our Upper Valley group. And thanks to Rob Kidd, who's our staff for the chapter, our conservation program manager, have been putting on these great conversations. So we're just glad to have you here today. Tonight's topic, as you can see on the shared screen, is how the pandemic is exposing environmental health disparities in the rural context of Vermont's environmental injustice. And we're really lucky to have a group of experts here that are going to talk about their work. So our speakers just are Kesha Ram, who's from the Center for Whole Communities and a senior fellow there. Marianne Engelman-Lado, who's the director of the Environmental Justice Clinic at the Vermont Law School. We have Ching Ren, who is a PhD candidate at the Rubenstein School of Environmental and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. We also have Jennifer Byrne, who's a fellow at the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School. And this group has been working on a project that you'll hear about, but we're really lucky to have them. Kesha, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. That is great. I think there's a lot of room to not only learn more about the basic concept, but also then to apply it to Vermont, which I think as those principles were developed more often than not in urban areas and in indigenous communities, it's helpful for us to explore what this means for Vermont. Before I introduce the rest of our team, I thought it would be helpful if we started with a definition. And so I'm going to take the liberty to share my screen and the presentation that we've put together for all of you. So I try and keep watch of everybody on the side of the screen, but I'm going to count on Rob and Rachel if there are big questions that we need to answer before we continue. We will explain who we are as Rejoice in a little bit, but tonight we did really want to focus on what environmental health disparities already looked like in the country and in Vermont, what it means to focus specifically on rural environmental injustice, and how the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of environmental health disparities, or if not exacerbated, brought them to light. I think, so I'm like not, oh, I clicked and it moved. Okay. So what is environmental justice? This is the US EPA definition. We've used some other ones in different communities, but I think this one is a really important grounding touchstone. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And I put that picture next to the definition because I think it's just kind of sums up the basic idea that we often don't want to believe or don't believe that the place we live could be killing us. And there are people who don't have that privilege or luxury around the country. And there are people even around us who may discover they lived near an asbestos mine or had a high amount of lead in their home, and that their home or their neighborhood are indeed killing them. So that kind of, in my mind, breaks down to the most emotional core of what it means to live in a healthy community or an unhealthy community and experience environmental injustice. So that brings us to, what is environmental justice policy? How do we combat environmental injustice? And I will have my BLS colleagues chime in who are much more expert in this area. But I thought this was helpful because a lot of you do generally advocate for policy solutions, and this is something that will help ground you in what do we actually mean. So I think this is where a lot of people said they're familiar with the principles, this sort of idea that that these are things everyone should have equal access to. We know about the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, just like we know about other, like the Bill of Rights, and yet we had to have the Civil Rights Act to demonstrate that some people didn't have access to our basic rights, and the playing field needed to be leveled. And similarly, these are things that some of us may take for granted and other people are fighting for every day. Oops. above and beyond having equal access to, these basic amenities, it's the idea that there's a procedural component to what it means to engage with your government, and what it means to either lodge a complaint or get information about environmental hazards or environmental practices in your community, so that you should have the ability to participate in public processes, get access to information, and be able to share your thoughts in your own language, which we're a little bit behind on often in Vermont. Finally, ensuring and having a backstop to create a more distributive system that takes into account the accumulation of pollution in certain communities. So often it's a one-off, is this going to cause more traffic in a community? Is this going to add more pollutants? But what is the cumulative effect over time in a community? And how do we make sure there's no experience of discrimination in environmental regulation and policy? So who are we, and what does that have to do with Vermont? Our acronym REJOICE stands for Rural Environmental Justice Opportunities Informed by Community Expertise. A little bit of a mouthful, but we really wanted to capture that not only are we really focused on rural areas, particularly Vermont and Northern New England right now, but that it's important to us that the basis of our exploration be based in community knowledge and expertise, that they are really the best arbiters of their own experience and can help shape policies that they can then access and really truly utilize. Our partnership has 4 main collaborators, and then we have a lot of other people we bring into our orbit as we can. The Center for Whole Communities, where I'm based, which is an environmental and social justice nonprofit based out of Burlington that works with a lot of national environmental partners like the Nature Conservancy and others. Toxics Action Center, who a lot of you are familiar with as a regional player across New England, and also having a strong presence in Vermont. University of Vermont, and particularly people in Rubenstein School and Community Development at the University of Vermont, and Vermont Law School. And we're well represented with Ching from University of Vermont and Marianne and Jennifer from Vermont Law School. And I'd love to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves right now. I'll do the calling out because I know that sometimes gets awkward on Zoom. Can we start with Ching? Are you ready to just say a few words about yourself and your research?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ching Ren. I'm a graduate student at the University of Vermont, and my advisor, Bindu Panikkar, is a professor at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, and she was one of the initial members of the REJOICE project, and she brought all of her graduate students, undergraduate students to the project. And we're very lucky to know this amazing team and have been trying to contribute to the research aspect to it. And my personal interest of research is food justice, and I will talk about that a little bit later.
Thank you. Can I go to Jennifer?
Hi there, I'm Jennifer Byrne. I'm a fellow in the Vermont Law School's Environmental Justice Clinic. I've been working with REJOICE for the past 2 to 3 years, and doing the basic and now more detailed policy research and analysis. We've compared state policies from across the country and are now working to integrate them with what we hear from some of our other work and connect our policies to Vermont specifically.
And finally, last but certainly not least, we're very fortunate in the state to have the expertise of Marianne Engelman-Lado, who has been on the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and splits her time between Yale's Environmental Justice Clinic and now Vermont Law School's Environmental Justice Clinic. Marianne, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. And it is such a pleasure to meet all of you virtually. So my background is in both civil rights and environmental justice across the country. I've worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and ran a legal program at a place called New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. And more recently was at a national NGO called Earth Justice. So I bring that experience, that including a lot of work in rural areas, rural areas, some of which are similar to Vermont, although nothing is as beautiful perhaps, and rural areas that are not so similar. Like we still do a lot of work in Alabama, which has very different dynamics. I came to Vermont Law School to launch an environmental justice clinic, and we launched in September. We have 2 semesters under our belts, and we work with interdisciplinary groups of students, including Vermont law students, as well as then collaborating with students at Yale School of Public Health and Yale School of Forestry. So we can bring to communities both advocacy and legal work, as well as science and policy work. And I'm really fortunate that Jennifer had already been plowing the fields of environmental justice with Rejoice, and she's a fellow in the EJ clinic, and I get to work with Rachel, who I'm really excited about working with. So we have a power team here, and I'll be talking a little bit more about some of the ways in which other states and work going on at the national level might help to inform work we're doing here, and the ways in which we want to make sure it's relevant to Vermont. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. So you'll be hearing less of me and more of them really soon. But first, we wanted to talk about what the history of having a conversation around environmental justice looks like in Vermont. It isn't necessarily represented on here, but our first environmental justice grants from the EPA were around 1999-2000, with a few different mobile home communities that were experiencing sewage and wastewater backup, a lack of clean drinking water, and we've had a couple other small grants that have gone to copper mines, et cetera, for them to do some education work. So we have some history with working with the Civil Rights Division of the EPA, but probably less than many other states. We're actually one of a handful of states left. Ching is trying to help me make sure that we have this number right, but it's somewhere between 7 and 10 states left without an environmental justice policy or framework. Virginia just passed one, I think, a couple weeks ago. So this number even may be inaccurate on that front, but we are just one of a handful of states, along with, I believe, Maine, that is left without this kind of policy. I introduced an environmental justice framework. It was more of a working group, and the impetus to collect data, environmental health data based on race, et cetera. When I was not a legislator, in fact, some people remember I started in the legislature in 2008, but in 2007, I introduced a bill with then member of the House Natural Resources Committee, Rachel Weston. It was my senior thesis, and it was what encouraged me to run for the legislature. So that was when my thesis was finished. So for about 14 years, I've been trying to advance environmental justice as a concept and framework in the state. And a lot of the other folks on the call have been doing that either here or in other parts of the country. We don't have any state protections for communities facing a disproportionately high burden of environmental pollution beyond what is federally mandated for all states for projects that they fund. And right now, Rejoice is working to make sure that those policies and that framework is informed by what community leaders and community members have to say. And we are resourcing them to participate in our community conversations, going out and meeting them at their doors, and doing in-depth interviews, just trying any way we can to meet people where they are. So our goal by the end of this is to work with the Agency of Natural Resources, the Department of Health, potentially the Agency of Transportation, and Department of Housing and Community Development, to see how we can create a framework that doesn't just put all our eggs in one basket with environmental regulation, but recognizes that this is a kind of shared problem of how environmental health affects different communities. This is, I mentioned that we've been doing these community conversations, and this is, sort of a word cloud that Jennifer created out of our first community conversation, which was in Rutland. And so if she's up for it, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to talk about the themes that we've been uncovering in our community conversations and other outreach.
Sure. So as Kesha said, this is from our very first conversation, which took place in July of last year in Rutland. We've since had one other conversation in Newport. And some of the most common themes that have been coming up, and believe it or not, they are connected to environmental justice, have been transportation, issues of access to transportation, costs, indoor air quality, which in a lot of ways is tied to disaster resiliency, which is later in the list, but it could be, due to lead paint or mold, indoor mold, and so a lot of, we see that in some of the mobile homes that are more affected by flooding, and mental health and healthcare access is an extremely prevalent issue in rural communities that don't have. We hear about people needing to drive, to Burlington or to Dartmouth to access healthcare. Disaster resiliency in many ways. Hurricane Irene really brought to the fore some of the issues of inequity in accessing recovery funds and just being able to get back on the grid for some people, or recover from flooding. And so what we're hoping with some of this work, especially in this time, is to sort of check back in on what has been done since Irene, and what improvements maybe or extra set of eyes do we need to set to make sure that we're looking at and caring for the most vulnerable in the community. And finally, food security, which can entail access to healthy, clean food. And my colleague Ching will go more into this, I believe, on the next slide, because that's her focus. Ching, take it away.
Yep. Thanks, Jennifer. So with the Rejoice project, we take food justice as a very important aspect in environmental justice. That is not to claim that food justice should be nested under the frame of environmental justice. Actually, food justice is a part of the food movement that has multiple waves and multiple origins. For example, the food security issue that Jennifer mentioned actually originated in the 1970s, and when the food prices on the international market went way high, and a lot of developing countries started worrying about their internal food security, how they can get enough food to feed their population. But that concept also became a widely accepted content in the policymaking in the United States, because people just realized that identifying preconditions that lead to hunger is more important to prevent the damages when hunger actually appears. So eventually, people have been, in Vermont, we have a very, very robust local food network, and Vermonters care about where our food is produced and how we eat. So we're all very familiar with some of the discussions within the framework of food movement. For example, local food, community food security, food justice, food sovereignty. And why is food justice special, or why do we use the framework of food justice here in this discussion? Because we want to emphasize the fact that food justice, the role of racial and economic justice in our food system, and we advocate that access to healthy, culturally appropriate, and sustainably grown food is mediated by inequalities of race and class. That's why we adopt this frame of food justice, but that doesn't mean that the other waves of food movement are not important. And obviously, within the framework of environmental justice, we want to emphasize the key links between food justice and the environmental justice. For example, of course, food is grown with natural resources, so naturally it is a environmental justice issue. But there are some also other key links between food justice and the environmental justice. They both care about community needs. They both pay attention to engagement and empowerment, and they care about sustainable communities and the local agriculture. They target system-related issues, etc. So there are a lot of key links. And as many other environmental justice issues from more recent studies, we know that in Vermont, some populations are more likely to experience food insecurity than other populations. For example, as part of the Rejoice project, we, as the UVM team, conducted a survey last summer, in 5 EJ communities around the state. We knocked on people's doors and asked them a lot of questions, and some of the questions were food related. For example, we had one question that asked people, do you think you have access to fresh and healthy food? On average, there were about 9.3% of the 525 respondents who said they did not have access to fresh and healthy food. But if we when we broke it down by gender and income, we found that women were much more likely to say that they are they're not able to get fresh and healthy food compared to men. And also people who live under the 2018 federal poverty line are much more likely to say they're not able to access fresh and healthy food. And that number is even more drastically different for another question where we asked people, do you think you can afford fresh vegetable and fruits daily? And 88% of people said they could afford. 88% of the people who lived above the poverty line said they could afford it, but only 56% of the people who lived under the poverty line said they could afford it. So these are just some very quick numbers about how some of the populations in Vermont can be affected by food insecurity disproportionately. And also, the COVID-19 pandemic happens, and we also interviewed a lot of experts and community organizations, and one of the themes that that came up from the interviews that we conducted was that people, a lot of Vermonters are actually on the verge of food insecurity. So they might not be food insecure right now, but they are just one paycheck away from being food security. And when the pandemic happened, that really came to the reality of a lot of those people who are one paycheck away from food insecurity now become food insecure. And another UVM team led by Meredith Niles conducted another survey on Vermonters, and then they didn't target environmental justice communities. That was a general survey, but they reviewed that 27% of Vermonters in general are food insecure during the pandemic, and 80-something%, I think it was 84% of Vermonters who did not have enough food in the past 12 months continue to not have enough food. So that really gives you an idea about how hunger and food access could be an issue. And this picture is Vermont National Guard and the Vermont Food Bank distributing MREs, meals ready to eat, to the communities. And I looked up some numbers today because I was curious how many MREs were distributed. And it seemed that just in Rutland County, more than 100,000 MREs were distributed on a single day. And that number was almost doubled compared to how many MREs were distributed during Hurricane Irene. So that gives you another example of how the dire situations that Vermonters have been facing during this pandemic. And of course, a crisis could be an opportunity actually for local food systems. And because studies have shown that only if the local food and healthy food is more convenient and cheaper than alternatives from big supermarkets, and consumers would be willing to buy it. So right now, going to a grocery store is is a less desirable activity, and is not necessarily as cheap as it usually is. So it might be an opportunity for local food to get more accessible for more Vermonters. But when we are trying to do that, there are different aspects that we want to think about. In environmental justice, we have some different kinds of justice. And Kesha used one frame, and another frame is to think about these 4 different aspects. We think about distribution justice, which is in terms of food justice, it means equitable access to food and food production resources, including land. There is a recognition justice, which means respect and recognition of the identities of all communities, and there are needs for culturally appropriate food. And there is a capacity justice, which means the communities have the capacity to build their knowledge of nutrition, food production, and food preparation. And there's also procedural justice. That means encouraging voices and leadership of marginalized populations. So pretty similar to the justice concepts that we use in EJ. So I think I'll just stop there, and I believe we have time later to talk about these issues, just to start a conversation. And I'd love to hear from all of you about food justice.
Thanks so much, Ching. And we are going to try to go quickly through the rest of the slides, but also see some great questions. We are working with migrant justice from the perspective of food justice and their experience of worker safety on farms. And we can get into that a little bit more later and answer all your other questions, I think, with some of these next slides as well. So just in terms of the future of the work in Vermont, we have really felt that one of the big themes is people feeling like they're experiencing recurring trauma from Irene and other natural disasters and haven't quite had their needs met there. So we are pivoting our project right now in the current moment to try and understand what unmet need looks like among digitally underserved communities. Those communities are the Somali Bantu community, the Bhutanese Nepali community, the migrant farm worker community, seniors, people with disabilities, and geographically isolated folks who are specifically going back to the Northeast Kingdom. And we are compensating people for those conversations, just like we compensated them in our community conversations, because it's really important to us to recognize that even before the crisis, but now even more so, who can come to a public meeting is often divided economically and in terms of people who have leisure time, the ability to leave their family. So we offer childcare and food when we're in person. And right now we're trying to really meet people where they are. Zoom calls are not going to work for everybody who doesn't have a laptop, et cetera. So we're really grateful to High Meadows Fund for some seed funding that allowed us to move in this direction. We're going to have some help for the resources from the Department of Health. And we just received Vermont Community Foundation funding for this work as well. So we're really grateful. And I am going to allow Marianne to talk more about what it looks like to map environmental distress, but that has been some of the work of this group already in figuring out what that looks like in Vermont and where we're having our community conversations. But Marianne's going to zoom us out a little bit now.
You're on mute, Marianne. Sorry.
Oh, for the next couple of minutes, I want to talk about what environmental justice policy means, and go back to federal, and sort of the larger national picture and what happens in other states. And I'll just note, someone in the chat asked about New Hampshire. I actually haven't focused on New Hampshire. One of the things the clinic is doing, the EJ clinic is doing this summer, that builds on work that Rejoice has already been doing and Jennifer's been working on, is updating a 50-state survey of environmental justice laws and policies across the country. There was a survey published in the Hastings Law Journal in the early 2000s. It's grossly outdated. The neighboring states, including Massachusetts and Connecticut, have EJ laws and policies. New Hampshire has an active EJ movement, and there was an effort just a couple of years ago to try to investigate, and then that was successful in getting investigated, a cancer cluster that was seen through the lens of environmental justice. But I'm not as familiar with whether New Hampshire has a robust environmental justice set of policies. The other thing to keep in mind at the state level is we might be talking about a set of legislative enactments. Some states like Massachusetts, like Virginia recently, their legislatures have passed definitions of environmental justice. they may have passed a mission statement that then becomes embedded in the way of a Department of Environmental Conservation or Environmental Quality operates. They may have passed laws that say, like in California, that the distribution of certain funding has to take account of priorities set through the lens of environmental justice. And in some states, quite aside from what the legislature has said, the Department of Environmental Quality or Conservation uses its discretion and authority within its authority to set policies. And so if there's authority, for example, to regulate or to do permitting, that they can require an environmental justice analysis even in the absence of legislation. So when you think about, does another state have a set of policies, there are a number of places to look at: the laws, executive orders, an agency set of policies, et cetera. So, so that's a project we're undertaking this summer together with legal clinics at the University of Texas in Austin and the Conservation Law Foundation at the office in Massachusetts. The big picture here, Kesha mentioned earlier that EPA has an Office of Environmental Justice and an External Civil Rights Compliance Office. And the External Civil Rights Compliance Office has made clear that to comply with civil rights laws, states that receive federal funds, which is all states, have to have language access policies, public participation policies, identified individuals who coordinate civil rights, and a number of other provisions that really map over with a robust environmental justice program. So that's one of the overlays of what we're talking about, that all states have to have certain components of ensuring that, particularly in the procedural aspect of environmental justice, that all people get included in permitting, and that the states take responsibility for, and in rulemaking and regulations, that it's inclusive, and that all people, without regard to language and national origin or race, are included in and participating. In addition, at the federal level, in the last 10 years, EPA launched EJ Screen, and I wish we had gone back to that that poll and could ask all of you who's used EJ Screen, because it's been around now for a number of years, and it enables you to go in, and let's say you are a industry and you are going to site a facility and do a permit. You could go in and drop a pin and figure out what are the other sources of pollution, what are the other vulnerabilities of a community within 1 mile, 3 miles, et cetera. And it's really a powerful tool. As we'll talk about in a sec, states are now doing similar kinds of tools with a more granular information and more robust information that is really exciting, and provides us, communities and environmentalists and agencies, with the ability to really understand how to manage the question of environmental justice in a particular area. EPA also has grants that are available. I'm just going to go really quickly because I want to make sure we have more time in Q&A. Grant programs that are applicable here. And I want to mention that there are 2 bills in Congress, not expected to pass this year, but are really the seeds of a more robust environmental justice policy at the federal level. One is the EJ Act of 2019, introduced in the Senate by Senator Booker and in the House by Congressman Ruiz, and the EJ for All Act, which was introduced by Congressman Grijalva and McEachin this year. And they both have very similar components of, among other things, ensuring that the cumulative impacts of multiple sources of pollution and the social determinants of health, like poverty, like health status, are taken into account in permitting under the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. And this is a very high priority in the environmental justice world across the country, to really make sure that when permitting is done or policies are passed, that they're not done in the abstract, but we really are thinking through what is the effect on the ground in already overburdened communities. Can we go to the next slide? Just to emphasize a few things I've already touched on in states. that when we think about what does state policy, environmental justice policy look like, it typically has the following forms. And again, it can be in statute, or it can be in administrative regulation, or an executive order, et cetera. It will include typically incorporating environmental justice, which is defined in some way, into its mission. And to use an example of California, California not only has a definition of environmental justice and has a mapping tool like EJ Screen, or like the tool that Ching talked about before, but it has a number of statutes which use the mapping tool. So when they distribute funds, they target those funds to the communities that are most overburdened and have the greatest need, have the most vulnerabilities in looking at the social determinants of health. In addition, their Attorney General uses the tool to target where their resources are going to go for environmental enforcement. These mapping tools, therefore, are really important in incorporating them in decision-making, in permitting, and taking account of the cumulative impacts of where other facilities are and where those vulnerabilities are, is really sort of where we're going in the country. And as I said before, EJ policies typically involve public participation policies, language access policies, and I actually can't see what we have at the bottom of the slide because I see slide 11, but you can read it. And and typically have an EJ advisory board. and I should say it's not only states that are considered sort of liberal, like California and the state of Washington, but I work in North Carolina, and Governor Cooper appointed an EJ advisory board 2 years ago, and they're still figuring out what their functions are and how they're going to operate, but it's moving forward. So there's sort of a menu of ways to move environmental justice and integrate it into the way we do things to have a more just approach. I'm going to turn this back over to Xing briefly. I know we want to move to Q&A, but just to describe the work they're doing to develop a mapping tool.
I'll keep this really, really brief. So in the mapping tool, we want to make sure to include 3 components. As you can see in the color blocks on the top of this diagram, we want to include environmental risks. We want to include health risk factors, which are the underlying conditions that may make people more vulnerable to environmental risks. And then we want to include social vulnerability. So in short, we combine those 3 components and identify the communities who are the highest risk with all 3 aspects.
And that's how
I'll just add, oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to add that there are many states that are working on these kinds of mapping tools and integrating them into decision making. Go ahead, Shim.
Oh no, I think that was Kesha, right?
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Kesha.
Well, I just wanted to point back to how we're starting to develop where we go and how we engage with folks has a lot to do with the environmental distress that we see in their community, where they fall in these indices. So this just starts to give you a picture, a little bit hard to read on its own, but it's the beginning of our data that we're hoping to be advancing. That is all we have for you. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned more about environmental justice than you knew before, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but we can also leave you with our contact information in other ways as well. And thanks.
So great. And this is, thank you so much for the presentation. We had a really robust chat room with questions, so I encourage folks to continue. If you want to ask a question, just either raise your hand or put a chat in there, and then we'll call on you to ask your question. But just to kind of jump us off while folks are maybe formulating what they'd like to ask. You know, a lot of the folks that are members of Sierra Club and also that may be on this call traditionally do a lot of work with climate change advocacy. And I'm just curious from this group, where do you see the intersection of your work and how do you see that fitting into maybe some of the more traditional environmental advocacy that we've seen in the state? So that's directed, I guess, to anyone who wants to take that. Thanks.
Does anyone want to start off with the intersections and what they look like in other states, or I'm happy to. I think, you know, we see a lot of urban areas, really highlighting climate justice, urban heat island effect, having a lack of green space, etc. We didn't tackle climate justice in this presentation, but at the same time, when we talk about disaster resiliency, as some folks may know, it's still sort of suggested that people at the time of Hurricane Irene, 8% of the population lived in mobile home communities, and 40% of the population affected by Irene were mobile home residents. So there are huge disparities in who lives in low-lying areas, who's going to be affected by natural disasters. And not only are they affected, but how do they engage in the response? How do they get resources? I remember specifically going to visit a mobile home park at Duxbury right after Irene, and they said it was like the helicopters were flying over going straight to Waterbury, and they felt like a completely forgotten country, and no one came for like a week. So, how we tackle our natural disaster response has a lot to do with why we're seeing people experiencing trauma and feeling unheard over and over again, and want to really capture how they're experiencing this disaster, which is not necessarily climate related, but you have folks who are going to be left out of a lot of digital communications or English only communications. And that can be the same for any disaster where you're trying to recover. Who comes to our state in the future in terms of I actually consider myself a climate immigrant. I wouldn't say climate refugee, but when I moved here from Los Angeles, I thought they have much cleaner air and water. And we may see more people who look like me or just don't look like your typical Vermonter who want a rural life and better access to natural resources for their families. We have to think about, are we welcoming and are we ready for that kind of diversity and people who really want to live closer to the land that, have different complexions. So I think those are some of the ways that we're experiencing that in a rural setting. But of course, also trying to pay attention to what migration from urban areas will look like that may be underwater in the future.
Yeah, I'll build on that and just kind of zoom out with a national perspective based on two experiences I've had. And this really responds to Rachel's question about the interplay between what might be seen as traditional environmental law and traditional environmental concerns and issues and the significance of environmental justice. I'm a member of what's called the GC3, the Governor's Council on Climate Change in Connecticut, and Governor Lamont issued an executive order this year to bring together people to really help the state meet its climate change goals, and injected equity into that conversation. The first round of the GC3 had not included equity, so they had these goals, reduce emissions by X amount, that had paid no attention to how that would play out in terms of the distribution of benefits and burdens, and realized over the last few years that that was a mistake. It was a start, but we need to be taking account of those benefits and burdens. We don't want to exacerbate inequality. We want to think about how everybody can fit in. You need to think about, if you're thinking about solar, are incentives for solar just for homeowners? Are incentives for, we're not going to meet our goals unless we think about all of these issues in a more equitable way. So there are people all across the country. There's a set of groups that called, including traditional environmental groups like NRDC and Earth Justice and others, who were involved in this conversation, calling for what they call an equitable and just climate action platform. In the GC3, I co-chair an equity working group to work with the adaptation committee, the mitigation committee, to really figure out who are the vulnerable populations, how do we make recommendations that will be equitable and meet our goals, and actually will be able to meet our goals because they're equitable. Another example, just to briefly mention, is my time at Earth Justice. And during my time at Earth Justice, which again is a traditional green group that started by focusing on species and beautiful places, increasingly focuses also on environmental justice. And that's because it's central to its mission. And during the time I was there, we were working on, a mission-driven statement for why is environmental justice central to its mission. For years, we've tried to figure out how to get our hands around the issues of cumulative impact. It simply isn't good science to think about the effects of mercury or benzene or anything else on its own. And some of the tools we're developing in the environmental justice context make more manageable. We're in this exciting moment where there's data and it makes more manageable our ability to really understand and make decisions, taking into account cumulative impacts and what's happening with communities that are grossly overburdened. So it's good science, and it relates very directly to the mission of environmentalism.
That's really helpful. I just want to call out, Brian Tokar asked a question about accessing the underlying data for the mapping tool. And in the chat, just for the benefit of the recording, that you can email Ching-Ren at uvm.edu to get information. She also shared a demo version. Ryan, looks like Ryan Kincaid had a question earlier on about whether, do you want to ask your question about whether other states, do you feel like that was resolved, or would you like to ask that question now, Ryan? Oh, his mic isn't working. Okay, so Ryan's question was just about whether policies and frameworks in other states are effective. I feel like we did cover some of the frameworks, but is there kind of a model for Vermont that's been working?
I think Marianne can probably answer the specific models that we would love to borrow from, and DEC was already doing that work when we sort of began our work together. I think what our coalition has tried to impress upon the larger community really strongly is that the best environmental justice policy brings stakeholders within that state and those communities to the table and make sure that it's meeting their needs. So, the particulars of the Abenaki community, migrant farm workers in our state, low-income folks, just going to Rutland and hearing this is the area that always floods and where there's a lot of needles on the ground, et cetera, that gives people the connection to the policy framework that they will then use to advocate for themselves. So you can't really sidestep that by just implementing a policy that works in Massachusetts or Minnesota. You have to really build it from the ground up. But then there are great models that we want to make sure legislators and others know exist. So I'm sure Mary can share that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I would say, like environmentalism, environmental justice is a work in progress. And part of what works is public participation and having ownership and having dialogue, so that whatever is developed and implemented is really key toward the needs of the communities, and particularly the most affected communities. So that's a model that works. Public participation works. But in addition to that, I think this model, again, it's a work in progress of, and let me go back to public participation. There are a lot of best practices in public participation. And we could talk more about what is included in a good public participation policy, what is included in a good language access policy. There are models out there, and we're learning all the time how to do better. And there are models not only in the environmental justice context, but in the transportation context. Even here in the state, I'm sure there are better, good models that we can draw upon, and in neighboring states. But I think in terms of what is really exciting right now that works, is the incorporation of a cumulative impacts analysis to identify communities most in need, based on a local understanding of what are those vulnerabilities. So if you're in a coastal community, being in a floodplain is most important, right? If you're in a place where there's a lot of food insecurity, that may be most important in determining what are those factors that you're considering. But then having that kind of database and mapping tool that can then be used in decision-making, in permitting, in resource allocation, in environmental enforcement. I think those are some models that are really exciting, and that policymakers, communities, environmental justice communities are really gathering around and trying to move forward.
Great. Marianne, there's a question in the chat. You had asked me to repeat the name of the coalition that you mentioned, beginning with the words equitable and just, when you were referring to climate.
I will put the a link in the chat, but it's the Equitable and Just Climate Action Platform.
Great. So we've got time for a few more questions from the group. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question, or you could put it in the chat.
Well, I actually do have a quick question or an observation. That it's interesting to hear you talk about participation, because that's been a particular concern of mine. I've been following the development of a bunch of climate justice related efforts, but here in Vermont, the Global Warming Solutions Act has sort of transformed from being a counting carbon emissions type of effort to a real solid resilience, climate resilience planning effort. And there is mention, a specific mention of the underserved communities and most vulnerable communities. And they're actually working on that the next couple of days in the Senate. But interestingly, those voices have not been in the room at all while this policy is being developed. And that's been an ongoing concern to me. And when I talk to people who advocate, let's say, for low-income, for low-income people or for housing, what I hear often is it is really hard to get those folks, because they're so busy just staying alive. It's hard to get them to come to be part of the policy discussion. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of years through that process.
Thanks, Steve. You're absolutely right. I have gone on nature walks with legislators to talk about our project. We have spoken in House Fish, Wildlife, and Natural Resources. I used to be vice chair of Natural Resources and Energy, but I know they split them up and I can never remember. So there, and I've been talking to Bill Lippert, House Healthcare, about this as well. There's a lot of interest in what we're doing, but I do think it really needs to be more formalized, and it would be great for them to hear directly from affected communities, indigenous communities, et cetera. One thing that I think was sort of hidden in what we talked about is, as some folks may know, over 25% of Vermonters can't really even get to the grocery store or a doctor's appointment right now because of transportation barriers. That came out really strongly in our conversation in Newport, where they also have energy poverty and people are heating their homes with their stove and a space heater. And so, yeah, for a lot of the Vermonters that we're talking to, getting to the State House is not a priority. I can't stress enough, it feels like because we have, thankfully, fewer strings attached to the resources that we have first prioritized paying people and feeding people to come to our meetings. And we have a lot of local planners and leaders say they've never seen a room like that. People say, is this the place where I get $20 cash? And we say, yeah, and then they have great ideas about their experience. But, if you can't see where your next meal is coming from, or $20 means a lot to you to be at a meeting, you're not getting much further than communicating with us. So we're trying to compile as much as we can and share it.
I would just add, I'm sorry, can I just add one thing? That I think one of the challenges is resources, and another challenge is trust. And sometimes communities have spent time coming out and trying to reach out to the polluter, and reach across that fence, or try to reach out to their government, or try to reach out to other people. And it takes more time and more of their resources. And at a certain point, you sort of also give up. So, I mentioned the GC3 earlier, and we've been doing on the equity working group a lot of outreach to the indigenous communities in Connecticut and to others. And it is absolutely understandable that people don't want to come out and participate. And it takes the kind of work that Rejoice is doing, person by person, really engaging, being in it for the long run, to build that trust, so that people will feel that that their voices are going to be valued if they take that time. And it's not a personal thing that there's a lack of trust, it's an experience thing. So there are best practices, and that's why having a plan for public participation and thinking through, in this particular community, what are the kinds of approaches like Kesha was talking about that we need to adopt to engage the public. How do we engage them? How do we build that trust? And so that's an important dialogue. It's a great question because it's an important dialogue to be having.
Just wanted to mention a comment that Ryan put in the chat. Ryan says, love the idea of cumulative impacts analysis and making that accessible for all people. I'm currently trying to figure out the amount of microplastics in the water where I grew up. And I think that information like this about pollution, toxins from factories and landfills, it's not well known or available to a wider audience, and certainly not to the most vulnerable. And thank you for your work.
Yeah, I saw that, and I just want to say I really cut my teeth in this movement in Los Angeles, where I grew up. I worked for the Coalition for Clean Air in high school as an intern. Didn't really work for them, but I was super jazzed. And we were working on getting perchloroethylene out of dry cleaning establishments. And what was my job working with the team that I was working with was to help Korean immigrants understand the proposal and understand what they would need to participate, because guess what? They own 2/3 of the dry cleaning establishments in Los Angeles County. So, you know, leaving them behind would have been separating environment and economy and making them feel like this was a movement that didn't care about them. So I've always cared about industry pollution and industry toxins. And I remember when we were working on one of the bills about consumer toxins, we borrowed language from Maine, and it said, this does not include any industry toxins. Like, all of that whole section was really clear. And I went to the legislator who was pushing the bill, and I said, and it passed, you know, it was all about consumer information and you know, it's a big thing. I think Sierra Club and others worked on it. But he said, oh, well, we borrowed it from Maine, and we didn't think we should muddy the waters by talking about industry toxins and pollutants. And I've never forgotten that. It's just something in Vermont that, you know, we've not wanted to sort of rock the boat, and we had gone one toxic substance by toxic substance, and then we started to build a whole consumer information process around it, but we haven't really tackled industry toxins like dry cleaning industries, et cetera, and really asked them to change in major ways.
Sorry, my internet went out for a moment. Did someone have a last question? Oh, Jack, you're muted. Are you asking your question?
I'm sorry. I'm Jack Cushman. I'm with the Upper Valley group of the Sierra Club. And we are engaged in a process of trying to focus more on environmental justice in our self-described mandates. And I wonder how a small group like ours within a big organization can develop ideas for what are the specific needs in our local region where we could be most productive and where we could exert the most leadership.
I think one thing that we've really wanted to stress, and we've stressed it in committees or in public process, is that sometimes the most vocal groups aren't the ones who have the most environmental distress in their community, aren't the most cumulatively impacted. And, you know, so while we appreciate the environmental movement, the whole environmental justice movement was born out of a lot of communities being left behind and being the place where everything was dumped because nobody else did want it in their community. So, you know, places like Standing Rock and Love Canal and others have demonstrated to us what it looks like when a community is way overburdened. Those are the folks we care the most about. In Vermont, in rural communities, they're often isolated into their homes. They don't have good indoor air quality. They have lead in their homes. They're isolated by living, you know, and working 6+ days a week on a farm as a migrant farm worker who doesn't get a lot of access to other spaces. So I would say it takes a lot of relationship building to do it right and to listen to the people that are most affected and really honoring their expertise, that their experience is true expertise. They might not speak the same language as you. They might not, you know the same lingo that environmentalists tend to throw around. I'm on the board of the Vermont Natural Resource Council, and you were talking about Global Warming Solutions Act and TCI. And I kept saying, oh my gosh, we just lost it. We just lost this issue for a lot of Vermonters who don't play with the same acronyms and don't have the same language as us. But a lot of people are environmentalists who don't consider themselves under that term. And it just takes a lot of work to reach those folks. I would say Upper Valley, you know, has a great active groups. I've talked to Asma El-Houni and other people sort of doing social justice work in the Upper Valley. Start there, you know, understand their issues, go to their meetings, and you know, be part of what they're doing, and honor that, you know, most of the first environmentalists in this country were women and people of color. You know, were the people who were actually trying to preserve the environment, map the environment, understood the environment, had a relationship with the environment, were working the land, you know, and build from there. Just honor that, you know, women in India have been chaining themselves to trees for 150 years, and Sacagawea, you know, was the one who really discovered the West, and Harriet Tubman knows most of this country better than John Muir. So, you know, these are the true environmentalists in our country, and starting with that kind of humbling thinking, I think will take you really far in, you know, being able to reach people where they are.
I'd also mention, Jack, if you're interested, Sierra Club has a lot of really great resources for doing that kind of work. We did a training, or more like a workshop a few years ago in the Upper Valley, and kind of on, you know, how to identify those issues and how to, you know, maybe do that work and engage in that space. So that's something that we could also consider redoing if folks are interested.
Somebody asked about upcoming conversations in the chat room. Here's our next couple ones. May 27th, Mega Dam and Mega Damage. Our local activist, Steve Crowley, has been deeply involved with that coalition of folks. And it's actually about flooding of the lands up in Quebec and native lands. So we can continue that discussion about environmental injustices. We also have a discussion with the Vermont Climate and Health Alliance on June 3rd. But all of our other events are listed on actually our YouTube channel, and actually this through this bit.ly link, bit.ly Vermont Community Conversations, where we'll have an edited version of this particular conversation as well. But anybody who's on our email list will get notified of the upcoming conversations we're doing. And if you participate in one of these, I will remind people in a couple weeks of some of the other ones we're doing.